The Jerry Pal podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, improving the health and well-being of older Californians and their caregivers.
Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, I'm very excited today. We're getting close to our 200th podcast. And I can't believe it took us so long to have this person on it. Who do we have?
We are delighted to welcome a palliative care clinician, researcher, communication extraordinaire, a luminary in the field, James Tulsky, who is chair of the Department of Psychosocial Oncology and Palliative Care at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham Women's Hospital and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Welcome to the Jerry Pal podcast, James.
Thank you, Alex and Eric. It is absolutely thrilling to be here. Better than Oprah.
So this podcast is it's going to be about decision-making and communication. It really stemmed from a paper that James just published in Patient Education and Counseling on triadic agreement about advanced cancer treatment decisions.
You almost said advanced care planning.
That's
not controversial right now.
That is not controversial at all. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But before we get into all of those topics, James, you have a song request for Alex.
I do. So I chose the song Triad, which is a little obscure. It was written by David Crosby, and it really was made popular by the Jefferson Airplane. And it is a kind of spooky song about a triadic relationship, about three people in a relationship. And there's a chorus in there about why can't we go on as three. I'm not sure it really relates, although since the study is about triads and this is a triad, and mostly more than anything else, I wanted to challenge Alex to do his best Grace Slick imitation. So,
well, I'm doing this more like David Crosby style, and we'll see. He's got these haunting sort of jazzy open chords. We'll see what happens here.
You want to know how it will be, me and her, or you and me. You both sit there with your long hair flowing, your eyes alive, your mind still growing, saying to me, what can we do now that we both love you? Why can't we go on as three?
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much. You got the haunting part of it.
You can tell Alex loved playing that song.
Yeah, it's pretty different. I like the different part. That's pretty neat.
Okay, James, can we go back in time a little bit? When I think about experts in communication and decision-making, your name pops up there at the very tippity tops. How did you get interested in this as a subject?
I've been interested in this forever.
Yeah.
I actually came out of sort of an ethics frame, and that's, was my background early on. And so I thought about things using that framework. And it was when I was a medical student and a house officer, and there were really a couple of things. One was that I found that I don't know why, this is probably a longer conversation, but I wanted to be where the tough conversations were. And I felt that that's where I added value. It was just kind of a natural place for me. And I kind of felt comfortable entering into that when everybody else didn't want to be there. So that was about delivering serious news and things like that. And I found myself gravitating. And then, the next step of that was decision-making, particularly around end of life. And I was struck just listening and observing conversations around me that what was happening was nothing like what the experts were saying was supposed to happen in those conversations. And So my first study I ever did was at your place, was at UCSF. And I decided to audio record DNR conversations between medical house staff and patients and see whether or not what happened was anything like what was supposed to happen. And you pretty much know the outcome there.
What's the outcome? What was the outcome?
So the outcome was that they rarely did any of the things that they were supposed to do as far as decision-making conversation around, explaining the options of treatment, about what's actually happening. And in fact, what they were really doing was trying to push people into decisions by portraying, sort of disastrous outcomes on one side, other kinds of things on the other. And they never, ever spoke about what we would call goals of care. And I'm saying these were like my colleagues. These are like, my fellow residents. Mm-hmm. But this is what was happening. And so it tried to shine a light on those conversations. And then from then on, I got hooked because I also loved, from a science perspective, I loved audio recording and then studying and figuring out what's actually happening in these conversations. And so I took it, first I did DNR conversations, then I did outpatient advanced care planning conversations, and then I did a bunch of oncology conversations, and I did more oncology conversations, and kind of went from there.
Do you think in the time that you've been doing this, we've gotten any better?
Oh, it's taking him a long time to come up with an answer. I'm worried.
Yeah. We have definitely gotten better, and yet I continue to see many of the same problems. Mm-hmm. I also think it depends on where you are. There are institutions where, people from our field in particular have had a tremendous amount of influence, where there's been a lot of communication training. All of our interns and residents at the Brigham go through training that hopefully tries to change that. Mm-hmm. And so I actually see them doing a much better job. And that actually feels good. I don't think many of them would have the conversation today that I saw in the early 90s in San Francisco. So that I think is better. On the other hand, since I train oncologists a lot in communication skills, there's still a lot of stuff that we could get better at.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we have gotten better at the goals of care conversations and the family meetings. I still worry about those code status conversations on the day of admission because they are so rushed and because it's just got to be documented in the notes and the orders and the sign out. I'm still having to go back and sort of redo those often. And at the conclusion, after a goals of care conversation. Well, let's revisit this issue that you talked about quickly on the day of admission to the hospital.
I think you're right, Alex. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think the problem is that we shouldn't be having those DNR conversations on admission. Mm-hmm. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
I agree.
Because we all know that conversation about CPR falls out of a much larger goals of care conversation, only naturally falls out of that.
Right.
And held in absence of the rest of it is, in fact, just going to make it harder to have it when you have to go back and revisit it, like you said. So, if it was up to me, I would just eliminate all those.
Yeah. I was, when I was a resident at the Brigham, where you are now, I gave a noon conference talk about this. And I said, my proposal is we stop having these conversations on the day of admission. And people were so upset, they stood up. They were like, what? No, you have to. I'm the night float. I got to know whether to code this person or not in the middle of the night. And they're sick. They're getting him into the Brigham. They must be sick.
I'm wondering, though, is it more like going to a nice restaurant? Early on, they may ask you if you have any dietary restrictions. And then later on, you talk about what's on the menu or if you go to what's in the omakase. So is it the same thing? It's not necessarily asking, because some people have strong preferences. So it's not asking which is the problem. It's not following up on that short discussion later on.
Yeah, I think getting to the very specific preferences is just so hard because they're so rarely informed.
Yeah.
So I think using your metaphor, if when people came into the hospital, we said to them, tell me if there's anything I should know that's really important about helping to take the best care of you.
Yeah.
Or what should I know about you that matters most, that's going to make a difference in my care of you? And there will be the occasional person who says to me, one thing I want to know is like, don't ever leave me stuck on a machine here forever. When I was like, okay, let's talk more about that. But most people are going to talk about other things, which might end up being more important.
Yeah. And it also, and now I'm gonna switch track a little bit to your current paper about the triadic involvement. It's often more than just the patient's preferences that are playing a role here. Is that right?
Well, that was what was really interesting. We were really curious about what's the role of the caregiver in decision-making, because almost all the literature, up until this paper, there are a handful of papers on triads, but not a lot. And most of the literature is on the dyadic relationship. And in fact, all the other stuff I've done has always been dyadic. And like, even when we've recorded conversations and the family members are there, we just kind of like shunt them aside in the analysis. So we decided to set this thing up.
And when you say dyadic, you mean physician, patient, or?
Physician and patient. That's the dyad, right? Because it's, unless the patient's incapacitated.
Yeah.
In which case it's clinician and family member.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of look at it like that, either one of those dyadic relationships. But it's a whole different story when all three are available and all three, have capacity. And so what we did was we didn't audio record, actually. We surveyed a succession of 70 triads in cancer care. This was all done at Duke when I was there, where we identified patients with advanced cancer who had recently made a decision. They'd had a scan, they had made some sort of treatment decision. And then we asked the patient, the family member, and the oncologist separately about, first of all, what they thought the goal of treatment was. And then the second thing is, how much influence did they think the caregiver had in the treatment decision? And what we found was that, first of all, there was a lot of discordance around what they thought the goal of treatment was. That's kind of old news. We've known that for a long time. But, we saw it yet again where, and more likely, and there was only, I think, 40% of the time did the caregiver and the patient and the oncologist all agree on the goal of treatment. So that's really problematic, because they're about to enter into a treatment decision and it's all about the goal. So that was one problem. But like I said, that's kind of old news, but it was nice to shine a light on that. And the other thing that was completely new was we also asked, about the influence of the caregiver. And again, 30-something% of the time did they all agree on that. And mostly what happened was that the oncologists underestimated what the patient thought the role of the caregiver was in their treatment decision-making. Patients put a lot of weight on what the caregiver thinks. But the oncologists none of us really are accessing those caregivers and actually including them in decision-making in the way that the patients probably would want. By the way, one last thing I'll say about this, which is that the caregivers underestimated their impact. And they thought they didn't have as much impact as the patients did. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that's going on as well.
Yeah.
And do you get a sense of if it's what the caregiver, I guess the question is, how much of it is what the caregiver wants for the patient versus the caregiver kind of influencing in other ways? I mean, I was just thinking back to multiple cases, including one recently where a patient was in hospice and decided to stop it because their family member wanted to pursue some other life prolonging therapies that wouldn't be covered in hospice. And the patient said, I'm going to do this. I'm doing this for this family member. I'm not doing it for myself. It was up for me. I certainly wouldn't be doing it. Do you get a sense? Is that what's going on here, or is it something else?
So I think that is an awful lot of what's going on. We did some qualitative interviews as well. And we also did an earlier study related to this. And I think that's a lot of it. The patients feel they need to to do what works for their family members or for their caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
And then they perceive that. And so there's a lot of that interesting, for sure.
So does that throw substituted, when we think about, I know we're going to probably get into advanced care planning in the future, but like decision-making or with surrogate decision makers, like substituted judgment. I'm going to put myself in this patient's shoes and do what I think this person would want. Does that throw this kind of idea out the window? Because for a lot of patients, they're also okay with what my caregiver would want.
I think it does challenge the notion of substituted judgment, unless you do true substituted judgment, which is where this is getting a little meta, but where you
I mean, Facebook?
Yeah, Facebook, right.
But where, you then have to think about what the patient would want, understanding the patient might want what I would want, but that gets mind breaking, right?
Yeah, you just blew my mind right there.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is important to think that way. Like I remember when there was a patient in a persistent vegetative state, and we talked to his wife, and it's been a fractured relationship. She's felt like the teams had stopped listening to her. And finally, she sort of confessed to us, like, look, my husband's disability checks are keeping us housed, me and his daughter. Like, he would want that. Like, that's like putting the substituted judgment in like understanding what he would want for his caregiver, right? These things are really complicated.
They are complicated, although I really appreciate the frame you put on that, Alex, because I so often hear that story about the checks, and it's used as a way to sort of dismiss or to kind of suggest ulterior motives by families, and it's often a really negative thing. But here,
financial conflict of interest there.
Right.
Exactly. Which, by the way, I think happens very rarely. I mean, I've seen it, but it's unusual.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet I think, if keeping my body alive kept my wife and children housed, I could see why, right? You think about that, listeners? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like maintaining someone who's been declared brain dead for a baby that's incubating inside them. That's happened too, right? It's the same kind of idea.
All right, James, what should we take home from this study? What should we do?
Before we get to take homes, can I ask a nitty gritty question while we're still on results?
Don't get too wonky here, Alex.
Okay. It's not. But my sense is that, and you write this in here, that the patients and the caregivers tend to be more optimistic in their goals than the oncologists were. And might it really be that the patients and the caregivers' goals are more optimistic? And is it the oncologist's goal? I mean, should they be, certainly they want to communicate that cure isn't possible, right? Because these patients all have advanced cancer. And yet, ought the goal to be to make the patient and caregiver know that cure isn't possible, and that the goal of treatment is to improve quality of life or to live slightly longer?
Yeah. Oh my God. I see this. It's a really good question. And I see this all the time. The oncologists definitely want to feel like they've transmitted the correct information. And I think the fact, and I need to say that the discordance in belief about goal being cure or not, I don't think is probably because anything was ever misstated by the oncologist. In some cases, they may not have, but they're actually pretty good.
Yeah.
About saying we're not going to, the classic oncology line is, we're not going to cure this cancer. We're going to treat it like a chronic disease. We're going to do our best, blah, blah, blah. The question I think you're asking is how hard do you have to hit people over the head with that? And even if you do, people are still going to resist because there's some infinitesimal possibility that the person will either be cured or live for an exceptionally long period of time. And they're going to believe that they're the ones, right? There's a lot of research that shows that.
Right.
Which people put themselves into the tail of the curve, right?
Yeah.
Because somebody has to be there. The problem is you have 90% of the people putting themselves in the 10% in the tail of the curve.
Right.
But that's a natural reaction. Should we support that? I don't see any reason why we shouldn't support it. It becomes an issue when it gets in the way of decision making, and it then leads to potential harm. And that's the part, or more importantly, leaves people to not be able to fulfill other goals they might have. And that's, I think, where the tension happens.
Right.
Well, I guess it's, I'm not going to go, I don't know why, that's not wonky, but is goals the right thing? Like when I think about goals, it's this nebulous, often like shared decision, like we come up with goals together. So what we're hearing from patients is their hopes, what's important to them. What we're talking about is our expectations as oncologists or as clinicians, and together, like all that messy stuff happens, and we end up with some like big picture goals. Is part of what's happening here is we're hearing expectations from the oncologists and hopes from patients, and there's a disagreement here between expectations and hopes.
Yeah, I think that's it. So, I mean, I don't even like the language of goals. I use goals. I talk about goals in care conversations all the time, but I actually never use the word goal with patients.
Yeah.
Because I find that like I get this blank stare.
Yeah.
And so what you just used, the language you used, Eric, is more likely. I usually ask them what's most important. What are you hoping for?
Yeah.
What are you worried about? And using that mess of stuff, then I try to make a recommendation that meets it. The catch where the expectations comes in is that what's the possibility? I want to give a realistic recommendation.
Yeah.
And then how much, understanding that there's actually a possibility that I can meet that thing that they want.
Yeah.
So I think that the other piece of this is then you have to tease out how much uncertainty they're willing to live with, what's their risk profile.
Yeah.
I find I don't have to go there like that a lot, but with some people you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think about it too, like, as I was reading this and I was thinking about goals is occasionally I'll play the lottery and Alex will tell me, that's stupid, Eric. You're not going to win. His expectations are that. But my goal in playing the lottery is to win. Like I am not playing it for any other reason but to win. I also understand I'm not going to win. Like I have that expectation, but I still have that strong goal and hope that I'm going to win. That's why I'm put down my dollar.
How much money do you spend on the lottery?
About $2 a year.
Right. Well, now here's my question. Would you do the same thing with $100,000?
If I was Elon Musk, why not? No. Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah. So when the harms start outweighing any potential benefit,
that's the whole catch.
Yeah. Despite my goal still remaining the same, which would be to win the lottery, I just want to play it because the harms outweigh any risk of reaching my goal of, buying a house in Maui.
Right. Which is like, for example, in oncology today with all the oral therapies, and a lot of them are actually not all that noxious. Expensive, not even always that. The question becomes, why shouldn't you just keep taking this pill? Right? Because who knows? And, the only thing you're not allowing, so this happens like, at Dana-Farber, this is like what happens all the time. The only thing you're kind of giving up is hospice because you can't be enrolled, but otherwise you get everything else.
Yeah.
And so then that makes sense. And I make that recommendation.
Yeah.
It seems to make sense. But at the point at which you really need this other stuff, we maybe have to rethink it.
Yeah. And in the VA, you don't even have to give that up. You can get concurrent care.
Exactly. Love the VA.
Yeah. So this all seems really messy and hard. Like decision making, like is there a path forward? Like you would now have, you're not just talking to the patient in front of you, you got this triad, and the triad, as far as a caregiver, may include multiple people. And I think from your past stuff like you've done, it requires both skill and expertise from the, clinician on their part to have these conversations. You have kind of people with different hopes and what's important to them involved in these discussions. Is this just a kind of a hopeless, futile exercise around decision-making?
It's not hopeless and futile, but it's messy and hard, and it's never going to change. And I think we deceive ourselves when we think it's anything else. And I think there are a lot of people who want to believe it doesn't have to be. Look, when I first started in this game, I had a fantasy that we were I actually thought about writing this like book about sort of the outcomes of each disease and being like as specific as possible. And I really believed that you could just map it all out there and it would all be like this probabilistic exercise. And it was my kind of like male logical thing that I was trying to like, put out there. And I actually continue to see this particularly from ICU. Young ICU docs tend to have this inclination as well, that if we just got it all right, there's an algorithm that would solve this decision-making problem. And the more I do this work, the further away from that I think we are. It's about so many other things. It's about emotion. It's about identity. It's about, other people involved and who you love and the nature of those relationships. And we're just not going to make it simple. And I think that when we try to force it into this logical decision-making box, we get into trouble. I really push back on that a lot. And I've kind of tried to run away. There might be decisions earlier on that work a little better. Maybe like the prostate cancer decision about, radiation and surgery and whatever, and you can kind of line up all of your preferences and you can kind of make all that work, maybe. But the stuff we deal with, don't see it.
So what's the path forward then, given how messy it is, that we still have to be part of these discussions?
To quote Diane Meyer, all you need is love. Alex and I were in a meeting last week where she gave a wonderful talk and said that the answer is love. I think there's a little bit of truth in that I think it's about being present with people, trying to understand as much about who they are as people, trying to find out, really what drives them, seeing the emotion where it's there and recognizing and responding to it and engaging with it. And then helping them make a decision and making a recommendation that you think matches as well as possible. That is not a paternalistic thing at all, because they still have the choice. But you're guiding people in that way. And I think people really want to be guided. I mean, there are patients that are not like this, but I'll tell you a story. So I had this guy who was, he had metastatic prostate cancer. He was absolutely brilliant. He had been trained in the Soviet Union as a physicist. He was a nuclear physicist, PhD. He was a refusenik. He was actually he was in prison there in like Siberia. And it was like, and then he came to this country and he decided to abandon physics, and he retrained and became a lawyer and was a very successful civil rights lawyer here. And now he was living with this disease, and he had incredibly particular ideas of exactly how he wanted everything to do. And he was like about the most rational person I ever met, including an awful lot of our conversations where he wanted a rational death. He had actually rented an apartment in Vermont so that he could obtain assisted dying when the time came. And what was so interesting was, despite his hyper-rationality, it just all failed. It all failed. It didn't work for him. He couldn't outthink himself of sort of the pain and suffering he was in. And then his wife, who was not like that.
Yeah.
And so, the end of everything else, finally, because his decision-making was so explicit, but he was also so stuck, no decisions ended up getting made. And finally, he started slipping away. And his wife was just agonizing because she knew how important it was. Yeah. She couldn't make it for him. And I finally kind of had to make it for her. And I, just take her out of this and just tell her what to do. And we've talked a number of times afterwards. It was the right thing, like that hyper-rationality just didn't help him.
Yeah.
So I got another question. You wrote with Josh Lakin and Rochelle Bernacki, two of my favorite people, a paper in Annals of Internal Medicine about communication as a medical procedure. We'll have a link to that in the Jerry Powell podcast notes. Like when I think about a medical procedure, like you have clear steps, there's an organized flow diagram pathway. Emotions are not part of it. Deviation should be, can be considered, but generally not part of that flow diagram unless it's part of that deviated pathway. Is communication really like a medical procedure, or is it something very different?
I think it's absolutely a medical procedure. I think we bring a set of skills and we bring a talking map and a roadmap to get there. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't go haywire, but it's no different than being in the middle of surgery and suddenly you pop an artery, right? So blood spurting all over the place, and you've got a way to manage that. And then when the blood spurts all over the place, you invoke another set of principles, clamp, and I don't do surgery, but whatever they do in there.
Can I just note that I've definitely had the blood spurt all over the place in the family meeting?
Like literally or figuratively?
I've been in that position and been like, oh no, we need to do something now.
But what did you do? You relied on you relied on skills, and if you're really good and you've done this a lot, it was automatic.
Right.
Right? In the same way the surgeon knows clamp, right? You immediately knew, whatever the tool you used at that moment was. Did you get curious? Did you praise? Did you, acknowledge the emotion? Did you bring in somebody else? Whatever it was an instinct that you knew from all your training, all your practice.
Yeah. I want to ask, we started off this conversation talking about how you got first interested in this and the work you did at UCSF, first tape recording, residents having discussions, and then experts in the field. We haven't talked about Vital Talk, but of course, many of our listeners know you are one of the, I don't know if principals is the right word, founders of Vital Talk, and which has been one of the reasons that the vehicles behind improved communication skills in the setting of serious illness in this country and probably beyond. Where do you see things going from here? Like, what's the future of communication research and communication skills? Like, what are the big barriers that we still remain, and what do we need to do to overcome them? Where do we need to do the most work?
So I think research and skills, or research and sort of training, are two different directions. Mm-hmm. I think on the research side, the place I believe we will go to, and I want to see us go to in communication, is something that I've referred to as the basic science of communication. Mm-hmm. That I really want to see communication increasingly broken down to its component parts and studied, so that we can figure out how. It's really broad sweeps that we talk about now, right? And even like in my papers and the audio analyses we've done, we're talking about like, do you respond to an empathic opportunity? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a bit of a broad concept, right? Yeah. But like all the little moves that we do and how they responded, we also don't know like how do they respond to different people, why, how does like different prognostic language work? And it can get super subtle, right? But why not? And I think we can study that. I think that we need to create standardized sort of mouse models to study it in. One of my colleagues, Justin Sanders, who has been here at Dana-Farber with us for a long time and just moved to McGill. Oh. But Justin was working with some virtual reality lab people at Bentley College here in Boston, and we've created a virtual oncology office, where you can go into this thing and you have an avatar oncologist who you're talking to, and we can actually practice and study like very specific comments and look at how this works versus how that works, and really come up with the component parts of communication. So I think a whole variety of ways of doing this. I think that's the direction we want to go, because we really still want to know what is right. And it's interesting, when I teach, I do a lot of training of oncologists, and frequently they'll say, I do it like this and this should work. And I'm not so sure, but I actually don't have the data to say that that's probably not right. So I think that's one direction.
But I guess going to that question, what would, you have these A/B testing, like, did this one work better than the other one? But how do you define work better? Is it patient satisfaction? Because we know if we give really good news, people are going to be happier. Is it less conflict, which would mean conflict may be bad when sometimes it's good? Would it be agreement with a prognostic statement? Which, like, what is good? What is better?
So yes, I mean, I think it's all those things. And so, for example, one of the things that we were playing around with and will continue to be doing is, we put little electrodes on their fingers and we actually see, how sweaty they get and all that. So you can measure anxiety and things like that. I do think anxiety satisfaction is one set. I think another thing is whether or not people retain the information. I think the satisfaction with the encounters, the trust. I mean, a huge one here is what engenders trust. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing is sort of trust in the clinician. Yeah. I think you can measure all of these. I think we're not sure.
And I guess timing of trust, right? Your trust in somebody may be different the day of getting some prognostic news versus, 3 months later, potentially if that prognosis turned right or wrong.
Correct. But at least what's going to, and ultimately you're right. I mean, that outcome is going to make a difference, but there are probably ways that we can say it that will leave people feeling more like, I was about to say seen and heard, because that's another outcome measure that we use now is, feeling seen and heard. So I think all of these matter.
What's the next thing for you? What are you most excited about kind of working on right now?
So, it's really interesting. My own research, I'll just be really honest. I'm not sure where my own research is going. What I've been doing mostly for the last few years is mentoring others. And I just love that. And so for me, the exciting thing is like what other people are doing and I can help them do.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it's not the stuff that I necessarily would do. And I'll be really honest with you. I was thinking a little bit about this podcast. I was thinking about this paper, and I thought you might ask something like this. And I was trying to decide, do I have a new R01 in me for sort of the next thing, or do I want to just kind of follow all of my mentees? And I'm not sure about that. Like one of my mentees here is doing psychedelic assisted therapy in cancer. And I'm just totally jazzed by that. I think it's really cool and it's fun to work with them, but it's not what I would have done primarily myself.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think, we have a repository of a gazillion audio recorded conversations and continuing to play with that. So it's mostly my mentees again, who are sort of playing with that.
Right.
Are doing things. I'm not it's not to say that I don't have the next thing. I'm not sure if it's going to be me generating it or not. I've never said that publicly, so I think I just outed myself in a way. But yeah.
Well, thank you. And of course, you're making amazing contributions through mentoring, and it probably has a multiplicative effect on what you're able to accomplish. I want to ask. It's so satisfying.
Yeah. I
want to shift gears. We talked about communication, serious illness. Where do you see advanced care planning fitting in with this?
Yeah, that's kind of been a thing recently. I recognize, that there's a lot of controversy around this idea that advanced care planning, some of us are saying it really hasn't worked and hasn't moved the outcome measures that it was supposed to move in any appreciable direction. I don't think, and I think what all of us are talking about is sort of advanced care planning, particularly advanced directives, but other things that look like that. I do still think that goals of care communication, serious illness communication, like this paper here, what was this about? This is about people who are living with cancer, who, there's a transition in their care and they need to be making decisions. That decision in real time, that is still critically important. If you want to call that advanced care planning, then I'm all in support of it. If you want to refer to advanced care planning as this thing where you're sitting around in your living room for this hypothetical thing that might happen down the road, and you're not even all that sick yourself right now, I think it's time for us to move away from that kind of research and and activity.
Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't work?
Because it doesn't work, and all the energy that's put into it could be better put into other places. And particularly when you don't select populations. It's useful to have a conversation when you're 60 years old around your kitchen table about what you might hypothetically want. It's just hardly likely to play out in any real way when you're actually confronted by that thing. But if you're sitting there and living with stage 4 cancer, I think you should talk about what's most important to you. And make sure that the care you get continues to align with what's most important to you.
I guess having come from Dana-Farber and Brigham to San Francisco and working in geriatrics and palliative care, I find that there's no bright line like between, when somebody becomes seriously ill and that they get older, and we know that things start to fall apart. They get disability, they get some cognitive impairment, they accumulate chronic conditions. And that sort of accumulation of them could be, when it's all put together, is that serious illness? And when did it become serious illness? So I have trouble finding a line in which we say, okay, that was before they were seriously ill, and that's advanced care planning. And now they're seriously ill, and we're talking about, serious illness communication.
So, here at Dana-Farber, we have something called Pathways, which is a program the oncologists use that as patients navigate along their illness, it basically recommends treatments at different times. And what we've done is we've identified poor prognosis nodes in Pathways where that whole disease group, like thoracic oncology, agrees that this point in your illness trajectory, it's a poor prognosis node. And what they're thinking is it means like a less than 1 year survival. So the question is, what's the poor prognosis node? I agree, it's mushy. Like you don't enter into it like with a scan. It's like in oncology, it's a lot easier because you get a scan and like everybody knows that's the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you look at the person and you use the surprise question, you're there.
Well, James, I want to be mindful of the time. It's been great having you on the Dairy Valve podcast finally.
For the first time.
For the first time. If you had a magic wand and you can change one thing that the field of palliative care is doing, do you have something that you would do?
Wow.
You can think about it. You can get a little song. Alex, give him a little bit of a song, and then we're going to go back to that question.
Sounds good. It's a little bit more of triad.
You're afraid, embarrassed too. No one ever in your sweet life has said such a thing to you. Your mother's ghost stands at your shoulder, got a face like ice, just a little colder, saying to you, you can't do that, it breaks all the rules. Why can't we go on as three?
That was awesome. Thank you, Alex. James, going back to the question, your little magic wand.
Loving that. So I think we're getting better at this. I think it is to understand the world from the perspective of the specialists in medicine that we work with. Mm-hmm. And that's where the care is getting delivered, whether we like it or not. And I think the more we understand about their world and about the care options for their patients, for the patients that they see, we can then end up doing a better job of treating them.
Yeah.
And that's something that we are, like I said, I think we're getting better at, and we're aligning better with sort of specialty care. Working in a highly specialty environment, I've realized the value of being able to do that. Mm-hmm. So probably not what not I'm not sure if it was what I thought I was going to say, but as I just kind of thought about what comes to mind, that's kind of where my head's at.
Yeah, it's almost using those palliative care skills that we have with patients, but also direct them towards our specialists, our referral sources too.
Yeah. And to understand the unique aspects of the care they give and why they end up, doing what they do and how it's embedded in the culture and the science of what they're doing. And then the better we can align with that, the better care we'll end up giving our patients.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, thanks for that answer. Thanks for joining on the Jerry Powell podcast. It has been amazing having you here.
This was so much fun, and it's still better than Oprah.
Thank you, Archstone Foundation, for your continued support. And thank you to all of our listeners for supporting the Jerry Powell podcast. If you haven't already, check out our new website. We kind of redesigned it. Welcome any feedback as well. Bye, everybody.